Principles, Life and Work by Ray Dalio. Summary and Analysis by Brevreds. Part 1, The Journey Begins, Embracing Reality, Extended Version. Ray Dalio's journey started with humble beginnings, and one of the most important lessons he learned early on was to embrace reality, especially when it's tough. This principle wasn't born out of a moment of quiet reflection, but rather through a series of brutal, hard-hitting experiences. In the early 1970s, Dalio, a young, brash investor, made a bold prediction. He was sure the U.S. economy would collapse after President Nixon took the dollar off the gold standard. This meant the U.S. dollar was no longer backed by gold, which Dalio believed would lead to a severe economic crash. He staked his reputation on this belief, advising clients to prepare for financial disaster. But the crash never came. In fact, the markets soared. Dalio had been so confident in his prediction that he ignored the warning signs and doubted voices around him. The result? He lost clients, credibility, and a large chunk of his fortune. The humiliation was crushing, but it taught him something crucial: reality doesn't care about your opinions. You can't just wish for something to be true and expect it to happen. Instead, you have to deal with the world as it is, not as you wish it to be. Imagine being in Dalio's shoes at that moment. You've built a career on your intelligence and financial acumen, and suddenly, in front of your peers, clients, and competitors, you've made an enormous mistake. The pressure is immense, but Dalio didn't run from this failure. He faced it head-on. He took this failure, dissected it, and turned it into one of the foundational principles that would guide him for the rest of his life: embrace reality, especially when it's uncomfortable. Dalio's mistake wasn't predicting incorrectly. Everyone makes bad calls. His mistake was being blinded by his own ego. He had become so attached to his opinion that he ignored reality. This experience opened his eyes to a fundamental truth. In order to be successful, you must constantly question your assumptions and be willing to change your mind when the evidence doesn't support your view. He went on to develop a culture of radical transparency at Bridgewater, his hedge fund, where every employee was encouraged to be brutally honest, especially when someone was wrong. In fact, one of his most famous policies was called the pain button. Employees were encouraged to press a button on their computers anytime they felt uncomfortable with a decision or situation. This triggered a discussion where they would openly address the discomfort, ensuring that everyone was dealing with reality, not just avoiding difficult truths. Radical transparency didn't just apply to his employees. Dalio held himself to the same standard. He insisted that his team challenge him when they disagreed with his decisions. This was an uncomfortable process. Who enjoys being told they're wrong? But it worked. It forced everyone, especially Dalio, to constantly confront reality. As painful as it was, it became one of the keys to Bridgewater's success. Dalio didn't just survive his early mistake. He thrived because of it. He learned to embrace failure as a necessary part of learning and growing. By constantly seeking out the truth, even when it was unpleasant, he positioned himself and his company to navigate the unpredictable nature of the financial markets. Part 2. Pain Reflection equal to Progress, Extended Version. Pain is not something most people seek out. But for Dalio, pain became one of his greatest teachers. He didn't always start with this attitude. It was his failures, some of them so devastating that they nearly destroyed his career, that taught him the real power of reflection. Let's dive into one of the most significant moments of pain in Dalio's career. It was 1982, and Dalio was making waves in the finance world with bold predictions about the economy. At this point, he'd grown his company, Bridgewater, into a small but formidable hedge fund, and he believed he was on the cusp of predicting another major economic downturn. Dalio had built his entire investment thesis around the idea that the U.S. economy was headed for a depression. He wasn't just thinking small-scale market correction, he was predicting a catastrophic event. He went on national television, giving interviews, and told anyone who would listen that the economy was about to tank. He was so confident in his analysis that he bet everything on it. And then, nothing happened. The market didn't crash. In fact, it did the opposite. The economy grew stronger, and Dalio's prediction turned out to be a massive blunder. This wasn't just a small mistake, this was the kind of error that ruins careers. And that's exactly what it almost did to Dalio. Bridgewater nearly collapsed. Dalio had to lay off most of his employees, and by the end of it, he was left with only a few clients and nearly no money. To make ends meet, Dalio had to borrow $4,000 from his father just to keep his company afloat. Imagine the pain of that moment. You've built something with your own two hands, and through a series of bad decisions, you've watched it crumble. Most people would have quit. But Dalio saw this as a turning point. He knew that if he didn't reflect on his mistakes and learn from them, he would never recover. Dalio went through every single decision he had made in the months leading up to the failed prediction. He wanted to understand where he went wrong. What he discovered was that he had let his ego get in the way. He had become overconfident in his own ideas and had stopped listening to opposing views. This reflection led to a critical realization: pain plus reflection equals progress. Here's what that means. Every time you experience pain, whether it's a failure, a setback, or a mistake, you have two choices. You can either ignore it and keep making the same mistakes, or you can reflect on it and learn. Dalio chose the latter, and it transformed the way he approached not just investing but life in general. He started keeping a detailed log of all his mistakes. Every time something went wrong, he would write down what happened, why it happened, and what he could learn from it. Over time, this practice of reflection turned into a system of principles, a set of rules that helped him avoid making the same mistakes again. This system became the foundation for Bridgewater's culture, where every employee was encouraged to reflect on their mistakes and learn from them. Dalio's willingness to embrace pain and reflect on it is what allowed him to bounce back from the brink of failure. Within a few years of nearly losing everything, he had rebuilt Bridgewater into one of the most successful hedge funds in the world. Story of the Mistake Log. Dalio's mistake log wasn't just a private notebook. It became a company-wide practice. Every employee at Bridgewater was encouraged to keep track of their mistakes and reflect on them. Over time, these logs became a treasure trove of lessons, and they formed the basis of Bridgewater's principles. One time, an employee made a critical error that cost the company millions of dollars. Instead of firing the employee, Dalio asked them to write down exactly what went wrong and how they would prevent it from happening again. This wasn't just about avoiding future mistakes. It was about creating a culture where mistakes were seen as learning opportunities rather than failures. Part 3. Pain reflection equal to progress. Let's step deeper into the story of Dalio's failure in 1982. Imagine the scene. It's a cold fall morning, and Ray Dalio, at the height of his confidence, walks into his office in Westport, Connecticut. Bridgewater's office at the time wasn't the massive high-tech headquarters it would later become. It was a modest space, almost bare bones compared to what you'd expect from a hedge fund. But inside, Dalio was making bold predictions and attracting clients who believed in his vision. He's just made a public appearance on national television, confidently proclaiming that a massive depression was about to hit. The tension is building. Markets are volatile and investors are holding their breath, waiting for something catastrophic to happen. Dalio sits at his desk, monitoring the markets, looking for the first signs of the crash. Weeks pass, nothing happens. The market starts to rise. Dalio, at first, believes it's just a fluke. This is temporary, he tells himself. The crash is coming. More time passes, and now the markets are surging. The phone rings. It's one of his major clients. They're nervous. "Ray," they ask, "are you sure this crash is coming?" Dalio, still confident, reassures them, "Absolutely, you'll see." But the crash doesn't come. Instead, the markets continue to thrive, defying his prediction. One by one, clients begin pulling their money out of Bridgewater. First, it's the small ones. Then, some of the bigger clients start losing faith. Before long, Dalio's confidence starts to crack. Maybe I was wrong, he thinks. Maybe I missed something. Soon, it's not just clients pulling their money. Dalio's own employees begin to doubt his leadership. Meetings grow tense. Staff members whisper in the hallways. The office atmosphere is thick with unease. The day comes when Dalio has to face the cold, hard truth: Bridgewater is in trouble. The company, which he had built from the ground up with sheer determination and drive, is falling apart. To survive, Dalio takes drastic measures. He lets go of staff. Offices that were once bustling with energy are now eerily quiet. Desks sit empty. The few remaining employees huddle in small groups, unsure if the company will survive the week. Dalio is now operating with just a skeleton crew. His finances are in such disarray that he's forced to borrow $4,000 from his father. It's a humiliating moment. Here's this once confident investor, who had been advising major clients and appearing on television, now groveling to his parents just to make ends meet. For most people, this would be rock bottom, but for Dalio, this became a pivotal moment. It's here, in the midst of failure, that he began to embrace the principle of pain reflection equal to progress. The reflection process wasn't easy. Dalio didn't just sit down and casually think about what went wrong. He obsessed over it. He replayed every decision, every assumption he made, like a film in his mind, dissecting each scene frame by frame. Why had he been so wrong? Why had he ignored the signs? What was it in his thinking that led him astray? It was in this obsessive reflection that Dalio had a breakthrough. The problem wasn't that he was wrong. Everyone is wrong sometimes. The real issue was that he hadn't created a process for learning from his mistakes. He realized that mistakes are inevitable, but if you reflect on them deeply and honestly, they become stepping stones to success. Dalio began what he called his mistake log. Every time he made a mistake, no matter how small, he would write it down. But it wasn't just about recording the error. He would write out why the mistake happened and what he could learn from it. This became a ritual, almost like a personal therapy session after each failure. At first, it was painful. Writing down your failures in black and white is never fun. It forces you to confront the harsh truth. But over time, Dalio began to see the power in this practice. He started noticing patterns in his mistakes. Certain behaviors, like being overconfident or ignoring dissenting opinions, kept cropping up. By recognizing these patterns, he could start to change his behavior and avoid making the same mistakes in the future. One particular entry from his mistake log was about his refusal to listen to opposing viewpoints during the 1982 crisis. He realized that his ego had blinded him. He had surrounded himself with people who agreed with him, rather than people who challenged his ideas. From this reflection, he developed a new principle: don't let your ego stand in the way of your success. This principle became the cornerstone of how Dalio approached both life and business. He began actively seeking out people who would challenge him. He wanted his ideas to be attacked from every angle, so that only the strongest ones would survive. This mindset transformed Bridgewater's culture. Dalio started holding meetings where anyone could speak up, regardless of their rank. Junior employees were encouraged to challenge senior executives if they thought they were wrong. Meetings became intense, with heated debates and passionate arguments. But Dalio insisted on this culture of radical transparency because he believed it was the only way to truly deal with reality. One story that illustrates this perfectly happened in the early days of Bridgewater's transformation. A young analyst, fresh out of business school, was sitting in on a strategy meeting. Dalio was presenting a new investment idea, one that he was excited about, but the young analyst had doubts. His data didn't support Dalio's theory. At first, the analyst hesitated. Who was he to question the founder of the company? But then, remembering Dalio's principles about honesty and challenging assumptions, he spoke up. "I think there's a flaw in your analysis," he said, voice shaking a little. The room went silent. Everyone turned to Dalio, expecting him to shut the analyst down. Instead, Dalio paused, thought for a moment, and then asked, "What do you see that I don't?" The young analyst explained his reasoning, pointing to data that contradicted Dalio's theory. Dalio listened intently, nodded, and then said, "You're right." He scrapped the idea on the spot. This wasn't just a victory for the young analyst, it was a victory for Bridgewater's new culture. The message was clear. No matter who you are, your ideas will be heard, and if you're right, even the most senior person in the room will admit it. This created an environment where the best ideas could rise to the top, no matter where they came from. Dalio's willingness to embrace pain and reflect on it didn't just make him a better leader, it made Bridgewater a better company. By creating a culture where mistakes were not just tolerated but celebrated as learning opportunities, Bridgewater became more resilient, adaptable, and ultimately more successful. Part 4. Understanding reality is the key to success extended. Imagine life as a giant puzzle. You're given a bunch of pieces, but you have no idea how they fit together. Success comes from figuring out how those pieces work, but here's the catch. The puzzle is always changing. What worked yesterday might not work tomorrow. The key to success, then, is understanding reality as it is, not as you wish it to be. Dalio learned this lesson through years of trial and error. One of his biggest breakthroughs came when he realized that most people, himself included, have a natural bias towards seeing the world the way they want it to be. This is dangerous because it leads to bad decisions. If you want to succeed, you need to see the world as it really is, even when it's uncomfortable. There's a story from the early days of Bridgewater that illustrates this perfectly. It was the mid-1980s, and Dalio had been studying the relationship between interest rates and the economy. He had a theory that if interest rates were cut, the economy would grow, and if they were raised, the economy would slow down. It was a simple idea, and for a while it seemed to work. But then, the Federal Reserve made a series of unexpected moves. They raised interest rates, and instead of the economy slowing down as Dalio had predicted, it continued to grow. Dalio was confused. His model wasn't working. Most people, when faced with this kind of contradiction, would either ignore it or rationalize it away. But Dalio wasn't most people. He dug deeper, trying to understand what he had missed. After months of research, he realized that he had been looking at the wrong variable. Interest rates were important, but they weren't the only factor driving the economy. There were other variables, like consumer confidence and global trade, that were just as important, if not more so. This discovery led Dalio to a critical realization. Understanding reality means being open to constantly learning and adjusting your model of the world. The world is too complex to be boiled down to simple rules. If you want to succeed, you need to be flexible in your thinking and willing to adapt when new information comes in. Part 5. The Power of Radical Transparency Extended. Imagine working in a company where every conversation, every meeting, and even every mistake is recorded for everyone to see. That's what it's like at Bridgewater. At first, it might seem overwhelming, even terrifying. But there's a method behind this madness: radical transparency. Ray Dalio didn't introduce radical transparency overnight. It was a gradual evolution of the principles he'd developed through years of reflecting on his failures and successes. After his near collapse in 1982, Dalio realized that one of his greatest blind spots was his inability to fully understand his own thinking. He wasn't always aware of how his emotions, biases, and assumptions influenced his decisions. And if he couldn't see his own blind spots, how could his employees see theirs? So, he set out to create a culture where nothing was hidden, not from himself, not from his employees, and not from the company. It started with small changes, like encouraging employees to speak their minds during meetings. But soon, it evolved into something much more radical. Every meeting would be recorded, and everyone would have access to those recordings. Now, imagine being an employee at Bridgewater during the early days of this policy. You're sitting in a meeting, and one of the senior executives, someone you've always looked up to, makes a decision that you think is flawed. Normally, you'd keep quiet. After all, who are you to challenge someone with so much experience and authority? But at Bridgewater, that kind of thinking wasn't just discouraged, it was unacceptable. One day, a junior analyst named Sarah found herself in exactly this situation. She was new to the company, only a few months in, and was still learning the ropes. But during a strategy meeting, she noticed something odd. One of the senior portfolio managers was advocating for a new investment strategy that didn't sit right with her. The numbers didn't add up in her mind, and the risks seemed higher than he was letting on. Sarah hesitated. Speaking up in a meeting full of senior executives felt daunting. But Dalio had made it clear, radical transparency meant radical honesty, no matter who you were or how new you were to the team. So, she raised her hand. "Excuse me," she said, her voice a little shaky, "but I don't think the data supports that conclusion. I'm seeing higher risk factors than what's being discussed here." The room went silent. The senior portfolio manager stopped, clearly surprised by the interruption from someone so junior. All eyes turned to Dalio, waiting to see how he'd react. Would he shut Sarah down, defend the senior manager? After all, it's not every day that a new employee challenges someone with decades of experience. But Dalio didn't defend the senior manager. Instead, he smiled and said, "Let's see the data." Sarah presented her analysis, walking the team through the numbers she'd been looking at. And sure enough, she was right. The risks were higher than initially assumed. The senior portfolio manager thanked her, and the strategy was revised accordingly. This wasn't a one-off event. Stories like Sarah's were common at Bridgewater, where the culture of radical transparency encouraged everyone, from the most senior executives to the newest hires, to challenge ideas, ask tough questions, and never be afraid to point out flaws. The point wasn't to be right all the time. The point was to find the truth, no matter where it came from. But radical transparency wasn't just about speaking up during meetings. It was about creating an environment where nothing was hidden, where even the harshest feedback was given openly and directly. At Bridgewater, employees regularly received performance reviews, but these weren't your typical sit-down conversations with a manager. These reviews were often done in front of peers, where everyone could weigh in on your performance. In one particularly memorable instance, Dalio himself received brutally honest feedback from his team. It was during a time when Bridgewater was going through a period of intense growth. Dalio had been focusing all his energy on big-picture strategy, trying to navigate the company through the complexities of scaling up. But in doing so, he had become disconnected from the day-to-day operations. One afternoon during a company-wide review session, one of his top executives raised his hand and said, "Ray, I think you're out of touch. You're spending too much time in the clouds and not enough time on the ground." The room went quiet. Here was someone telling the founder of the company that he wasn't doing his job well enough. But instead of getting defensive, Dalio listened carefully. He asked the executive to elaborate, and what followed was a candid discussion about how Dalio's focus on strategy was causing him to miss important operational details. Dalio didn't just accept the feedback, he embraced it. He made changes to his routine, carving out more time to be involved in the day-to-day workings of the company. And he later credited that feedback with helping him avoid major pitfalls during a critical period in Bridgewater's growth. This level of honesty might sound brutal, but it was one of the reasons Bridgewater became so successful. By creating an environment where everyone was encouraged to be radically transparent, the company was able to root out bad ideas before they could cause harm, learn from mistakes quickly, and constantly improve. Of course, radical transparency wasn't easy. It required a thick skin, especially when you were the one on the receiving end of criticism. But Dalio believed that the short-term discomfort was worth the long-term benefits. He once said, "The truth is essential for getting what you want out of life, and being radically transparent about the truth will make you stronger." One of the most famous examples of this philosophy in action was the dot collector tool Dalio developed at Bridgewater. This was a real-time feedback system used during meetings, where employees could rate each other on various metrics like clarity of thought, open-mindedness, and decisiveness. Imagine sitting in a meeting, presenting an idea, and seeing your colleagues rate your performance in real time. It could be intimidating, but it also created an incredible level of accountability. In one particular meeting, a senior executive was presenting a new investment thesis. As he spoke, the DOT collector showed that several employees were rating him poorly on clarity of thought. Instead of brushing it off, the executive stopped mid-presentation and asked the group, "Why are my ratings so low on clarity?" A discussion followed, and it became clear that his presentation was too vague, lacking specifics. The executive took the feedback, clarified his points, and the presentation improved. The dot collector wasn't just a tool for feedback, it was a way to ensure that every voice was heard and every idea was tested. No one, not even Dalio, was immune to its scrutiny. The tool democratized feedback, making it possible for even the most junior employees to rate their superiors. And it worked because it was all part of the culture of radical transparency. If you want to get to the truth, you have to be willing to put your ego aside and listen to what others are telling you, even when it's uncomfortable. Story of the baseball bat incident. There's a famous story from Bridgewater's early days, known as the baseball bat incident. During a particularly heated debate over an investment decision, one of Dalio's senior colleagues became so frustrated with Dalio's insistence on questioning every assumption that he stormed out of the office. A few minutes later, he came back with a baseball bat and slammed it on the table. "You need to stop being so relentless," he shouted. The room went dead silent. But Dalio didn't back down. Instead of escalating the situation, he calmly asked, "What do you think I'm missing? Why do you think I'm wrong?" The colleague, still fuming, explained his perspective. Dalio listened, took in the feedback, and adjusted his approach. The situation could have gone horribly wrong, but it became a defining moment in Bridgewater's culture. The message was clear: no matter how heated the debate, no matter how frustrated you get, the goal is always the same: to find the truth. Part 6. Building a Machine for Decision-Making, Extended. One of the core ideas that shaped Ray Dalio's success at Bridgewater was the idea of building a decision-making machine. To Dalio, life is a series of decisions. Some are small, like what to eat for breakfast, while others are life-changing, like choosing a career path or deciding how to invest billions of dollars. The key to success, he believed, was creating a system that could consistently make better decisions over time. Dalio's fascination with decision-making started early in his career. After his early failures, he realized that relying on gut instincts and emotions wasn't enough. He needed a way to remove his biases and make decisions based on objective data and principles. So, he set out to create a system, a machine, for making decisions. This wasn't a literal machine, of course, but a set of processes and principles that could be applied consistently to any decision, big or small. The idea was to create a system that could learn from mistakes, improve over time, and ultimately make better decisions than any single person could on their own. At the heart of this machine were Dalio's principles, a set of rules he developed through years of experience and reflection. These principles covered everything from how to think about risk, to how to deal with disagreements, to how to approach decision-making in a complex, uncertain world. One of the most important principles in Dalio's decision-making machine was the idea of believability-weighted decision-making. This was a revolutionary concept at Bridgewater, and it changed the way decisions were made at the company. Part 6. Building a machine for decision-making continued and extended. Let's dive deeper into believability-weighted decision-making, one of the most important innovations in Ray Dalio's decision-making machine. Imagine you're sitting in a room with 10 people, trying to make a decision. In most organizations, each person's opinion might carry the same weight, regardless of how much experience or expertise they have on the subject. But at Bridgewater, things worked differently. Dalio believed that not everyone's opinion should be weighed equally. Instead, the people with the most expertise, the ones with a proven track record in the specific area under discussion, should have more influence. It's not about rank or title, it's about believability. Here's an example. Let's say Bridgewater's investment team was debating whether to invest in a new technology sector. In the room, there's a junior analyst who's spent the last few months deeply researching the tech industry, as well as a senior manager who's been at Bridgewater for 15 years, but hasn't followed the tech sector as closely. Under a typical decision-making process, the senior manager's opinion might carry more weight simply because of his seniority. But at Bridgewater, that wasn't the case. Instead, the decision would be weighted based on each person's believability. If the junior analyst had a stronger track record of making good calls in the tech sector, her opinion would carry more weight than the senior manager's. It wasn't about hierarchy, it was about finding the truth. Dalio took this concept so seriously that he developed tools to measure people's believability. Every employee at Bridgewater was given a believability score in different areas based on their past decisions and track record. These scores were then used during decision-making processes to weigh each person's input. This system wasn't just theoretical. There's a great example from one of Bridgewater's more challenging periods. In the early 2000s, the global economy was in flux, and the company was trying to decide whether to bet heavily on commodities, particularly gold. There were strong arguments on both sides, and the decision was critical. A wrong move could cost the company millions, if not billions. At the time, Bridgewater's senior leadership team was divided. Some of the most experienced portfolio managers were pushing for a conservative approach, arguing that the risks were too high. But a few junior analysts, with fresh insights and a deep understanding of the current commodity market, were advocating for a more aggressive stance. In a typical organization, the senior manager's opinions would have likely carried the day, simply because of their authority and experience. But not at Bridgewater. Instead, Dalio called for a believability-weighted vote. Each person's opinion was considered, but those with a proven track record in commodities, even if they were more junior, had more influence. In the end, the aggressive strategy won out, and Bridgewater made a massive bet on commodities. The decision paid off. The firm made billions during the commodities boom that followed, and it was a shining example of how believability-weighted decision-making could lead to better outcomes. Dalio loved to remind people that the goal wasn't to be right all the time, it was to increase the probability of being right. By weighing decisions based on people's believability, you could improve those odds. It wasn't foolproof. Mistakes still happened, but it was a far better system than simply going with your gut or relying on rank. Two people I couldn't be more different from. There's an amusing story that perfectly encapsulates the power of this approach. Dalio once recounted a time when he was in a heated debate with two employees who couldn't have been more different from him. One was Bob Prince, a seasoned portfolio manager with decades of experience in macroeconomic trends, and the other was a much younger, introverted analyst named Greg Jensen, who had joined Bridgewater straight out of college and was known for his deep analytical insights. They were debating a complex question about the future of interest rates. Dalio had one opinion, and both Bob and Greg disagreed with him, but for different reasons. Bob, with his extensive experience, believed Dalio was underestimating the impact of global supply chain disruptions. Greg, on the other hand, had been digging into the data and saw early signs of inflation that didn't align with Dalio's assumptions. In a typical company, this would have been a classic case of boss knows best, and Dalio's decision would have gone unchallenged. But Bridgewater was different. Dalio believed in believability-weighted decision-making, and he knew that both Bob and Greg had proven themselves to be highly credible in their respective areas. So instead of sticking to his guns, Dalio called for a vote, where their inputs carried more weight than his own. The vote went against Dalio, and Bridgewater made an investment decision based on Bob and Greg's perspectives. It turned out to be the right call. When Dalio reflected on the experience later, he didn't feel embarrassed or defensive. Instead, he was proud of the system they had built. "It didn't matter that I was the boss," he said. "What mattered was getting to the truth. This is the essence of believability-weighted decision-making. It's not about ego or authority, it's about who has the best chance of being right. It's a system designed to maximize the probability of success, even when it means going against the boss's opinion." Story of the 2-minute rule. Here's another funny story that highlights how Bridgewater's radical transparency and believability system sometimes led to awkward but valuable moments. In the early days of the company's transformation, Dalio introduced what became known as the 2-minute rule. It was a simple idea. If you disagreed with someone in a meeting, you had 2 minutes to explain why. No long monologues, no drawn-out debates, just 2 minutes to make your case. After that, the other person got 2 minutes to respond, and so on, until they found common ground or agreed to disagree. One day, during a high-stakes meeting about the direction of the company's European investments, two employees, let's call them Sam and Julie, got into a disagreement. Sam believed that Europe was on the verge of an economic downturn and wanted to scale back investments in the region. Julie, however, had a different view. She believed that certain sectors in Europe, like renewable energy, were about to explode, and she wanted to double down. The debate grew heated, and the rest of the team sat in silence as the two argued back and forth, unable to reach a conclusion. Dalio, watching the situation unfold, decided to invoke the 2-minute rule. "Sam," he said, "you've got 2 minutes. Make your case." Sam launched into his argument, citing data on European unemployment rates, slowing GDP growth, and rising political instability. When his 2 minutes were up, Julie took her turn, presenting her research on renewable energy investments, government subsidies, and long-term growth projections. As the debate continued in 2-minute increments, something interesting happened. Both Sam and Julie began to realize that their positions weren't as contradictory as they had thought. Sam's concerns were valid, but they didn't apply to the sectors Julie was focused on. Likewise, Julie's optimism didn't negate the broader economic risks Sam had identified. By forcing each person to distill their argument into a tight, focused 2-minute window, the team was able to break through the noise and find a solution that worked for everyone. The 2-minute rule wasn't just about efficiency, it was about clarity. When you're forced to explain your argument concisely, you quickly find out how strong your case really is. And by giving each person an equal amount of time to present their side, you level the playing field, ensuring that the loudest or most senior voice doesn't drown out valuable input from others. The hiring process and the idea meritocracy. The story of Bridgewater's decision-making machine wouldn't be complete without talking about its rigorous hiring process. Hiring at Bridgewater wasn't just about finding smart people. It was about finding people who could thrive in the idea meritocracy that Dalio had created. And that meant finding people who could handle the intense, no-holds-barred feedback that was central to Bridgewater's culture. One of the most famous examples of this is the baseball card system Dalio introduced. Every employee at Bridgewater was given a baseball card that listed their strengths, weaknesses, and performance metrics. These cards weren't hidden away in HR files, they were openly available for everyone to see. In one hiring interview, a candidate was asked to share their biggest weaknesses, knowing that if they were hired, those weaknesses would be printed on their baseball card for all their future colleagues to see. The candidate, clearly uncomfortable, hesitated, but Dalio pressed on, explaining that radical transparency wasn't about shaming people for their weaknesses, it was about helping them grow. In another interview, a candidate with an impressive resume and stellar credentials was asked a simple question: what happens when you're wrong? The candidate, perhaps expecting the usual, "tell me about your strengths and weaknesses" interview questions, was caught off guard. He fumbled through an answer, trying to explain that he rarely made mistakes because he was so thorough in his work. But Dalio wasn't satisfied. He pushed the candidate further, asking, "But when you do make mistakes, how do you handle them?" The candidate continued to struggle, clearly uncomfortable with the idea that he might be wrong. It was a red flag for Dalio. At Bridgewater, being able to admit when you were wrong and learn from your mistakes was more important than having an impressive resume. This candidate, despite his qualifications, didn't make it through the hiring process. The baseball card system and the emphasis on handling mistakes were all part of Dalio's broader philosophy. It's not about being perfect, it's about getting better. Everyone makes mistakes, but the key is how you respond to them. Do you dig in and try to defend yourself, or do you admit your error and learn from it? At Bridgewater, the expectation was clear. If you couldn't handle being wrong, you wouldn't last long. But if you were willing to embrace the idea meritocracy, if you were willing to be radically open-minded and accept feedback, the rewards could be immense. Conclusion: how to apply these principles in your own life. The principles from Principles, Life and Work aren't just abstract ideas or corporate strategies. They're deeply practical, applicable to your everyday life, and can fundamentally change how you approach work, relationships, and decision-making. The goal is to create your own decision-making machine, one that helps you make better choices, embrace failure as a tool for growth, and ultimately build a more fulfilling and effective life. Here's how you can apply these concepts starting today. Embrace radical transparency. Start with openness in your communication. Whether you're at work or at home, practice being honest and direct, even when it's uncomfortable. Give people the feedback they need, and welcome it in return. This doesn't mean being harsh, it means striving for truth. When you're open about your mistakes and invite others to challenge you, you create an environment where growth and learning thrive. Create your own principles. One of the biggest takeaways from Dalio's life is the power of personal principles. Take time to write down your own set of guiding principles for making decisions. These don't have to be rigid rules, but general guidelines that reflect your values and help you navigate challenges. Keep them flexible and adjust as you learn more about yourself. Use believability-weighted decision-making when you're faced with a tough decision. Don't rely solely on your gut. Look for advice and input from people who have experience and credibility in that area. Weigh their opinions based on their track records, not their titles or seniority. This can be done in work meetings, family decisions, or even when seeking advice from friends. Be radically open-minded, challenge your assumptions, and be open to the idea that you might be wrong. Actively seek out opposing viewpoints, even when you think you're sure of something. Ask yourself, what if I'm wrong? And truly consider the consequences. This openness to learning will help you find better solutions and avoid costly mistakes. Fail well and learn from mistakes. Don't fear failure, embrace it. Dalio stresses that every mistake is an opportunity to learn. The next time something doesn't go as planned, don't beat yourself up or try to hide it. Instead, analyze it. Ask yourself why it happened and what you can learn from it. This approach will turn failures into stepping stones for success. Develop systems and algorithms for decisions. You don't need to be a tech expert to build decision-making machines in your life. Start by making lists of steps you typically take in making certain decisions. For example, if you're deciding on a job offer, create a checklist of factors that are important to you, like salary, company culture, and growth opportunities. Following this system can help you make more objective, thoughtful choices. Practice the 2-minute rule in discussions, especially heated debates. Give yourself and others just 2 minutes to present their case. This will help you get to the core of the issue quickly without going off on tangents or getting stuck in arguments. It promotes clarity and encourages everyone involved to focus on the key points. Foster an idea meritocracy, whether you're leading a team or participating in group projects. Encourage a culture where the best ideas win, regardless of where they come from. This requires setting aside egos and genuinely considering the merits of every suggestion. Implementing an idea meritocracy in your workplace or social group can lead to more creative and effective solutions. Visualize the machine. Think of your life as a machine. Every time something doesn't work out as expected, ask yourself how you can improve the machine. Is there a flaw in how you're processing information or making decisions? Break it down, find the issue, and fix it. This ongoing process will help you optimize your performance over time. Taking action, start today. The journey to adopting these principles begins with small, intentional steps. Choose one or two of the actions above and start applying them right away. Maybe you'll begin by embracing more transparency in your conversations, or perhaps you'll focus on building your own personal set of principles. Whichever you choose, commit to continuous improvement. The more you practice, the more these concepts will become part of how you naturally operate. Remember, this isn't about becoming perfect, it's about getting better each day. You won't get it right all the time, but that's okay. As Dalio says, pain plus reflection equals progress. So reflect, adjust, and keep moving forward. Thank you for completing another Brev Read video. Like and subscribe to see more of our videos. If you have a particular book that you would like us to summarize, please share it in the comments section below.